recording.
Well, I did the recording, but I didn't do it early enough. So we are recording now, so we'll get it all.
Okay, I'll need to be able to co-host
Okay.
so I can
Yep.
hear.
You are a co-host. Well, you're co. Wait, no. God darn it. You're a co-host.
Ah, okay, that works out.
Man. Wow. Getting a nice
We're building up.
group in. So
In
do
some
you?
ways, on a cold night like this, it's a lot easier to not have to go out
You're right.
in the park. Working on you.
A lot of background noise, Mark. Can you hear it?
Oh, it's my computer. The little whir.
I thought you were
Not the
breathing.
dogs.
Okay, so while we're waiting, do you want to hear something funny?
Yes.
All right. So at the New Canaan Library, I picked up this book, which is Swedish recipes, old and new. So in it, there was this letter. And so this woman is writing, it's a personal note in there. And the way she ends it, she says, "You must have lutefisk, although I've never met anyone who liked it. For your benefit, you could charge $2 to sample it and $3 not to. Good luck. Sounds like a great fundraiser. Best to all. Kindest regards, Susan." New Canaan Library.
I'm glad New Canaan has profound things in their library.
Yeah. So, by the way, Dwight, did you know Kirsten Flagstad was a Norwegian singer?
No,
Heard her.
Did you know that?
no.
She was one of the greatest sopranos of all time. She's considered the greatest dramatic soprano of all time.
I was at her concert at Carnegie Hall when she first came back to this country after the war,
Yes.
and it was very exciting.
You were at her concert at Carnegie Hall?
Sorry,
You were at her concert at Carnegie
I
Hall?
was.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
She was criticized for spending the war years in Norway.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Carnegie Hall was absolutely packed, and she got many standing ovations.
I can imagine that. Yeah. Yeah, she made a return to the stage after the war. And I know she sang at the Met in the 50s.
Yeah, extraordinary voice.
Yeah.
Julie, did you say Kirsten Flagstead?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we have a few more people coming in, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to mute everyone, and I'll ask Josh to unmute himself in a moment. If I can do this, if I can see anything. uh, wow, getting a good group.
See how many people are on.
Yeah.
38.
Well, it's great to have you all here. Welcome to our second night of the Midwinter Theological Study. My name is Mark Lingle. I'm the priest at St. Francis Episcopal Church. Glad to have you with us. And tonight we're going to be continuing the conversation around the theme for this year, which is what is the life worth living? And last week, Pastor Dwayne Peterson got us started, a wonderful presentation around a Christian perspective, or at least one of the Christian perspectives of what that might be. Tonight we're delighted to have with us Rabbi Joshua Hammerman, who will be speaking from the Jewish perspective. And basically this will be about an hour. I'll let Josh talk for as long as he'd like, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. If you can use a Zoom hand, that would be great, and that'll allow us to prioritize people as well as see who has questions. If you don't know about the Zoom hand and all of that, just unmute yourself and ask your question. We'll ask folks to stay muted while Josh is speaking, and then again, once we get to the Q&A part, please raise your Zoom hand or unmute yourself. And Josh, I'll turn it over to you, and thank you for being here, and thank you for your teaching tonight.
Thank you, Mark. This is such a pleasure. I've been doing this as part of this group for a few years now, and it's always wonderful when we get to greet everyone at our synagogues and churches. That's obviously not happening this year, so I figured I'd bring you to Jerusalem instead, which will actually be part of the presentation at the end. And also use the chat if you'd like to jot down questions so you won't forget them. And I'll try to go at a pretty good clip and leave some time for questions at the end. You know, I mean, it's very hard to really interpret the question of this class, what is the good life? Because it's so related to attitude as well as qualities of living. And it connects to the word happiness. What does it mean to be happy, or to be fully satisfied, or to have meaning in life? And the problem is, for Jews, that we are a glass half full religion, but a glass half empty people. And because Judaism is a profoundly optimistic faith, but you have to get past the kvetching first. So I'll start it with a story just to illustrate. A man boards a Chicago-bound train at Grand Central, sits down across from an old man reading a Yiddish newspaper. Half an hour after the train has left the station, the old guy puts down the paper and starts to whine, "Oi, am I thirsty? Oi, am I thirsty? Oi, am I thirsty?" If you need a translation for oi, I'll do it during the question and answer section. So the other man is at the end of his rope. Oh, this guy is driving me crazy. So he goes to the water cooler at the far end of the car, fills up a cup of water, walks back to his seat, goes back to the cooler after a few steps because he gets a second cup of water because this guy was driving him crazy. And he goes back and he stops in front of the old guy and clears his throat. The old man looks up in mid-oi, his eyes beaming with gratitude as he drains the first cup in a single gulp. And then he hands the second cup and he finishes off that really quickly. And he has a sigh of thanks. And then both are sitting in their seats. And just a couple of minutes later, we hear the cry, "Oi, was I thirsty?" Anyway, you had to be there. But we are this glass half empty people. There is a sense of foreboding. And if you have Jewish experience, Jewish history, you would understand why. And yet Judaism really is all about building toward a better world. It's about optimism. Back in the early days of my rabbinate, I taught 6th grade. I mean, I still work with young students, but I was the 6th grade teacher in the Hebrew school, which is always a great test of your early rabbinate, priesthood, or ministry. And at one point I asked the kids, so what's going to happen at the end of time? What's going to happen when it's all over, when the world ends or whatever? I just wanted to get a sense from them what they felt would happen. And I have to say that most of the answers, in fact, just about all the answers were, the sun's going to burn us up. This was a time of great fears of nuclear response so that the world will be blowing one another up. And then a little later on, I would ask, and they would talk about global warming, climate change. The sun will burn us up. We're just going to destroy ourselves. And the most optimistic kid said, before that happens, we'll inhabit Mars. But none really reached into the depth of our religious traditions, most of our religious traditions, not just Judaism, and said, we're going to figure this out. God's going to help us figure this out. There will be a messianic age or a Messiah or a return of the Messiah, as some believe, of course. But things will get better. And eventually, all the work of generations will come to fruition. Our life will have meaning through this work. That was something that you just didn't hear among those students. And you really don't hear a lot among Jews, because as I said, we've been tainted by history. It's very hard to be optimistic. But as I said, also Judaism is very optimistic. So I just want to make that clear from the beginning as we talk about what does it mean to be happy. So I'm going to just show you a little of where I want to go here. You can see some Jewish responses to what is the good life. And we'll come back to these. So what is the good life? What does it mean to be happy? In Hebrew, there are different words for happiness and joy. In fact, there are a lot of words. It's almost like Eskimos have words for snow. A lot of words. And some of them are piled onto each other, back to back to back, in wedding blessings, for instance. In one of the chapters of the book of Esther, which is our happiest of holidays, Purim. But the most significant word, the one that's most closely associated with happiness, is the word simcha. Now, simcha is also connected to Sukkot, tabernacles, our fall holiday, which is really the forerunner of Thanksgiving. So it's the harvest festival when we should feel the joy of the fully harvested crop. But what does simcha mean? And Sukkot is called Zman Simchatenu, the time of our happiness. Well, a while back, there was an archaeological find in Elephantine, Egypt, where there was a large Jewish community during the Greco-Roman period. And they found a simple real estate contract from an ancient Jewish community there, written in Hebrew, and it said, upon prompt payment, I deed you this land. And then, phrase that intrigued the scholars, this simcha with joy, love, and happiness. Now, you usually don't see joy, love, and happiness in a real estate contract. Basically, none of the ones I've ever signed have that. But the word simcha here is not about joy and happiness, really, but about acceptance in the context of that contract. And then later on, scholars came to understand that the root of happiness from that Jewish perspective is acceptance. And what better way to think of the well-lived life than a life of acceptance, especially in the fall, especially with leaves falling and nature dying all around us. That is the path to happiness. Acceptance based on faith as well as hope, mixed with gratitude. So the key to living the good life is to be grateful. In the Jewish prayer book, in our Siddur, most of our liturgy, almost all of our prayers are prayers of gratitude. The major sacrifices of ancient times in the Bible were the thanksgiving sacrifices, where we ask for things. Occasionally we ask for peace on Shabbat, but the Sabbath prayers especially are not really asking for specific things other than that, and maybe good health. But we start our day with a prayer, Modeh Ani, we thank you. So this is Jewish wisdom at its best. The Jewish happiness prayer promotes gratitude, which promotes flourishing. So I want to show you the happiness prayer. Let's see. Whoops, I'm going the wrong way. This was the New Year of Trees today. So anyway, here we go. Can you all see that? I hope you can. You see the Hebrew above and below. So we say this prayer every morning. These are the deeds that yield immediate fruit in this world and continue to yield fruit in the worlds to come. These are the things that'll make you happy. These are the things that make life worth living. Honoring parents, doing deeds of loving kindness, arriving at the house of study early morning and evening. The house of study, by the way, was also where prayers took place. It's one of the names for a synagogue. Providing hospitality, visiting the sick, helping the needy bride, attending to the dead, probing the meaning of prayer, making peace between one person and another, and between husband and wife. The idea that there would be domestic happiness within the household, that was seen as a microcosm for the world. If love and commitment can work inside a single home, in a marriage, then it can work anywhere. So that was very important for the rabbis. But then it says something really interesting. And the study of Torah outweighs them all. So in essence, the study of Torah, study itself, becomes the key to a life worth living. Even more than prayer, even more than they had already passed the sacrificial period, the temple was destroyed. The grappling with Torah, but only because it leads to all of these other things. So that's a really important thing to say, that prayer, the good life is achieved when we do those things. Judaism is very much a religion of action as opposed to faith, although hope really does play a large role, but it's more about what we do than what we believe. I want to show you something else, because not only do we do it, God does it. So in the rabbinic belief system, and this is from the Talmud, the reason we want to be good and do good and live good lives is because God has set that example for us. So here, Rabbi Chama, the son of Rabbi Hanina, said, what does the Torah mean when it says you shall walk in the ways of the Lord? Can a person really walk in the shadow of the divine presence? The rabbis were a little embarrassed at the anthropomorphism you find in the Torah. They were sort of a little beyond that in rabbinic thinking, which of course is centuries after the stories of the Old Testament, of the Torah. So rather it means, it says, you should imitate the ways of God. Just as God clothed the naked, as it says, and God made garments of skin for Adam and his wife and clothed them in book of Genesis chapter 3, so you shall clothe the naked. Just as God visited the sick, and then we see how God visited Abraham right after his circumcision in Genesis, which is an amazing thing. He was circumcised at 99. He needed visitors. In fact, he circumcised himself at 99. I will not go beyond that. So should you visit the sick. And visiting the sick is a major mitzvah, a major Jewish commandment, a very important value concept. Just as God buried the dead, as it said, and God buried Moses in the valley. Of course, no one else was around. So the assumption would be only God could have buried Moses. So should you bury the dead. And just as God comforts the grieving, as it says, after the death of Abraham, God blessed Isaac, his son, so you should comfort the grieving. So one of the aspects of the good life, then, is to imitate God and to live a life of good deeds, of kindness. That's part of being happy, and a very important part of being happy. There are other parts as well. So let me see, I'm going to go back to our slides. Oops. Okay, I think I know what the problem is here. I'll go back and then I'll go forward. Okay, forward and back. Here we go. So this is, again, a rabbinic notion of what are the qualities, what are the value concepts that make someone worthy of reward, but worthy of Torah. So it says here, Torah is greater than priesthood or royalty. I know that's small print, but I'll just read a few of them. So according to, this is in the Talmud, section called Pirkei Avot, Ethics of Our Ancestors, Torah is acquired through 48 qualities. So we have the first one, study. through a listening ear, through careful use of speech, through an understanding heart. Then you go to insight and fear and awe and humility and joy, and write down the list. A lot of this is actually a manual for rabbis, not so much for the average person, because most people were illiterate at that time, 2,000 years ago. So this was for rabbis on how they should treat their teachers, but how they should also expect their students to treat them. And so much of it has to do with humility and awe, as well as joy. Did someone have a question? Was someone talking? Okay, so I'll continue just to show you this is all the 48. Loving humanity, loving justice, loving honesty, loving God. You can see all of these, crediting not one's own success, how important that is. Being careful with our words, making a fence around our words, knowing that words matter, insisting on truth, insisting on peace, learning in order to teach, learning from our students, learning in order to do. And then the last one is sort of interesting, but it's a key concept in rabbinic thought, because there are so many rulings, so many quotes, that you should always say something in the speaker's name, which is, you'd think, well, I mean, all these other things, being truthful and wanting peace and all that, those are important, but actually not taking credit for something you didn't say, not plagiarizing, which seems so small, is actually a huge thing, because it leads to all the others. If you are honest about the ideas that are yours, like I'm telling you, I didn't make this up, the rabbis did. If you're honest about that, then you're more likely to be, the training wheels of honesty will lead to your being able to live an honest and good life. So that is very much, in the words of the rabbis, the good life. This is an interesting chart. This is, a chart of sort of modeled after, a table of the elements, except instead of scientific and chemistry, this is moral and ethical, and it has to do with the qualities that it takes to be, as we say, a mensch. So Yiddish giveth and Yiddish taketh away. Yiddish giveth the word oi, which I told you at the beginning, but Yiddish also brings us the most important vocabulary word that needs to become part of the English language. And some of you are familiar with the fact that I wrote a book called Menschmarks 2 years ago. I'm not going to advertise my book right now, because that would not be the humble thing to do. But in that book, I said that we should be striving for mensch to be the word of the year. I said back in 2019, I mean it more in 2021. We need to create a world where people are wise and courageous and decent and kind, patient, modest, joyous, loving, wondrous, balanced, leadership qualities, and with integrity. All of these qualities. I know it's hard to read this, but the idea of being a mensch is so important. It's so central, once again, to the Jewish concept of living a good life, service of others. Now I want to get to a guy named Maimonides. He lived about 900 years ago, very different time, but in many ways a very similar time, in that it was a time when Jews interacted very much with people around them, especially in Spain, in Cordoba, where he grew up, but also later in North Africa and in Egypt, where he was a physician, high up in society. At that time, Jews had a much better relationship within the Muslim world than in the Christian world, especially in Spain, as it was sort of ping-ponging between the two. So Maimonides was able to both succeed in terms of Jewish scholarship. He's called the greatest rabbi in history. From Moses to Moses, there was none like Moses. From the original Moses to Moses Maimonides, but also as a physician, as a man of science, and he explored what it means to live the good life. So it's just sort of interesting, and I'll show you a little bit. He had a book called Hilchot Deot. He compiled all the laws, the rabbinic laws, in an organized fashion. The Talmud is not written in a very organized fashion. So, and one of his volumes talked about how one should live, living the good life. So I figured I'd have to quote Maimonides. I'm going to do bits and pieces, but you can see here that right off the bat, the way to live the good life is to live as God would live, to live in God's image, to emulate God's ways, to love fellow Jews. But he was also one who went beyond the Jewish community. And he says to love the converts also. To rebuke, which means to be honest with someone, to give honest feedback, not to embarrass though, not to gossip, not to take vengeance, not to bear a grudge. So you can see a little bit. I'm going to just go beyond that though, because for Maimonides, living the good life meant living a life of moderation. He was the Joe Biden of his age, in that he believed and very much lived a life of trying to reach out to all sides. We'll see how far that goes now, but certainly his career has been part of that. So he talks about the straight paths and how important it is not to be easily angered, not to react, to overreact, but to always go for the middle path. Other qualities that Maimonides talks about on the bottom here: he should not be overly stingy, nor spread his money about, but he should give charity according to his capacity, not too much, not too little. Once again, the middle path. So let me tell you a little more. Maimonides says that there are some things that you don't have to be moderate about. One of them is humility and arrogance. You should tilt toward humility. Rather, he must hold himself lowly and his spirit very unassuming. Anger, he says on this third paragraph, is also an exceptionally bad quality. It is fitting and proper that one move away from it and adopt the opposite extreme. So here he's an extremist. Maimonides is an extremist for kindness. He then says, anyone who becomes angry is like one who worships idols. The life of the irate is not true life. That's the prescription from Dr. Maimonides, or as we call him with his initials in Hebrew, Rambam. Should always cultivate silence. Very interesting, coming from a rabbi. I'm sorry, I shouldn't be so self-deprecating. But Maimonides says that words matter. And you should speak only about what you know about. You know, it was interesting the other day when I think it was Dr. Fauci or someone who said how liberating it was to be told, if you don't know something, to just be silent and not say something you're not really sure about. So Maimonides said that nearly a millennium ago. And even with talking about Torah, and he's talking to rabbis here, you know, be brief, rich in content, brief. So I guess I should listen to him and move on. Maimonides was a doctor. So not just, you know, the golden mean in terms of the middle, the moderate sense in terms of study or in character, but also in how we treat our bodies. You shouldn't eat unless you're hungry or drink unless you're thirsty. And never put off relieving yourself, which is a good thing to know. You shouldn't eat until your stomach is full. You should drink only a small amount of water during the meal and mix that with wine. So always sort of taking the moderate perspective. He should be directed. The ideal person living the good life should be directing the totality of one's behavior to the goal. You know, when you do something all the way. But and with intentionality, as Jews talk often about the notion of having a sense of intentionality. And he gets into everything. He talks about eating and drinking and defecating and intimate relations, as he mentions here. So you can read it on your own if you're interested. I'll give you this. I'll give you the link. One should never be constantly laughing, nor constantly sad and depressed. Again, the middle path. And happiness, for Maimonides, is the middle path. So you can't always take the world lightly, nor should you take it too seriously. Similarly, Maimonides says you shouldn't be greedy, rushing for wealth and possessions, nor lazy and idler from work. So you should work hard and achieve things, but not, of course, to the point of greed. The general principle is that one should follow the midpoint quality of each temperament until all his traits are aligned at the midpoint. This is what is implied by the statement in Proverbs, make even the turning of your foot and make all your ways firm. Stand on firm ground with all that you do. So this is good. I think I'll stop here in terms of Maimonides and that element of the good life. So the good life also involves living with balance and moderation, at the same time living life to the fullest. So here's an interesting fact. Every year, I think it's the UN, they come out with a World Happiness Report. And routinely, there are 155 nations. The first dozen or so are Scandinavian nations, or Australia, or New Zealand, basically nations that haven't had a war in a long time or are totally surrounded by water. You know, in Scandinavia, I think the last time they had a war was in the Disney movie Frozen. I don't know. I mean, it's basically not, you know, it's not word association. You know, Denmark war. I guess if you're Shakespearean, it might be, but not recently. Israel always comes in the top dozen, maybe a little higher, but just about always in the top dozen. And that seems counterintuitive on the happiness scale. I mean, this is a country where, you know, the Meshuggah bus drivers, that's another Yiddish word, they're crazy. You got wars, you got insecurity, you got a lot of people attacking it all the time. And yet somehow, some way, people feel happy there. So what is the source of that happiness? And one of the things that I came up with when I was doing some investigating about this was the well-known chef and writer Dan Barber, who wrote about an experiment that he ran on a mokum carrot, which he was able to grow outdoors in the middle of February. It was, you know, the coldest time of year. And when it was ripe, he ran what they call a Brix test, which measures the sugar content. And it came to 13.8, which is very, very high. I mean, if you compare it to a basic carrot that you buy at Whole Foods that was grown in a much less hostile environment, the scale was 0. It read 0 on the same scale. So this mokum carrot, 13.8, the carrot grown in ideal circumstances, 0 in terms of the sugar quality. Why the dramatic difference? So he explains that this carrot was feverishly converting its starches to sugars because in those hard freezes, it didn't want ice to crystallize, because if ice crystallizes, it dies. So Barber said, and this is amazing, what you're tasting is sweetness, but what the plant, the root vegetable, is telling you is that it doesn't want to die. So in a sense, the sweetness, the happiness comes from the struggle. In the great novel, The Source, James Michener, who of course wasn't Jewish, but it's all about the layers of Jewish history, especially in the land of Israel. At the very end, there's a quote that I remember from my childhood. It struck me. Life wasn't meant to be easy. It was meant to be life. And that's what makes it all the sweeter. So I think when we talk about the good life from a Jewish perspective, partly because we've had no choice, it's a life that is sweet because it has been a life of struggle. And I think we're understanding that from an American perspective too, certainly this past year. But we've been tested in so many ways. And as we know, and we've discussed so often in terms of social justice, we've been tested for centuries and suffered, many have, for centuries. So in a perverse way, it makes, not to make us happier in the sense that we're satisfied with the things as they are, but that we have found deeper meaning in life. And the life that is lived with courage and with hope and with that kind of appreciation is the good life. So let me just end with a little bit on hope, because I think that's really important. You know, I get back to that whole notion that my 6th grade students didn't know, you know, what was going to happen at the end of time, but it wasn't going to be good. We were all going to burn up or have to leave the planet or whatever. In the Talmud, of course, the Talmud was written about a century, 2 centuries, a little beyond. The rabbis lived, though, right after the destruction of the Second Temple, year 70 of the Common Era, year 70. And unlike now, meaning unlike, let's say, 9/11, unlike Germany after World War II, which was so devastated, or London, unlike even the Capitol this month, they didn't clean it up right away. The temple was destroyed in the year 70. I visited Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, in the year 1973 for the first time, and there was still a lot of garbage on the ground. In fact, if you go there now, you will see the ruins. I mean, they're considered beautiful. There's moss growing around them. You have the Western Wall. It's lit up at night. It's gorgeous, but you will see it as a ruined temple. And so when the rabbis lived, the first of the rabbis, let's say a century after, or a little less than a century, they had to pass this place all the time. They had to walk past, you know, many of them moved out to other areas, up to the Galilee, whatever. But those who lived in Jerusalem had to see the ruins that were smoldering for a long time too. It wasn't just that you see a lot of rocks piled up and the destruction piled up. And they had to see it. And then they saw moss sort of growing from it, grass growing from it. And at one point, a group of rabbis were there, and they were all crying, except for Rabbi Akiva, who noticed a fox climbing on the ruins. And he laughed. Why did he laugh? And they said, Rabbi Akiva, why are you laughing? And he remembered a complex series of verses, interrelated verses from the prophets, that basically prophesied the destruction of the temple, which happened, and then prophesied that after that destruction, there would ultimately be a restoration. Zechariah, the prophet Zechariah, envisions that restoration. So Akiva was laughing because the first part had happened. It came true. That means the second part is going to come true. The temple would eventually be rebuilt. Jerusalem would eventually be rebuilt. Now, I'm not a big fan of rebuilding the temple, I have to admit. I don't know if you can see my background right now very clearly. I love to go to Jerusalem and see what it looks like right now, to see all of our faiths coming together, to see how incredibly beautiful the vistas are this is from Mount of Olives, Mount Scopus. These are the places that Rabbi Akiva looked down at the temple and laughed out of joy and hope for a vision of a Jerusalem that we can look at today without a temple, with a Dome of the Rock there, but with Jerusalem very much rebuilt. Rabbi Akiva understood that, and he was able to live the good life, the life of hope, the life of fulfillment of God's word in his vision. And Rabbi Akiva died a martyr. He died the most horrific death, torture, by the Roman authorities. But as he was dying, he said the words of the Shema, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." And his voice lingered with that last word of one, echad, as he died. So ultimately, the good life is about life being not easy, but life being meant to be life, as James Michener put it. Perhaps I could sum up with 4 questions, because we do a lot with 4 questions in the Jewish tradition. Living a good life is about how we answer these 4 questions. Do I act? Do I question? Do I care? And do I hope? If we can say a resounding yes to all of those, if we can live deliberately and act decisively, if we can challenge convention and assert individuality and cultivate the God's image within us, if we could reach out to our neighbor in love and compassion and turn those oys into joy in the pursuit of happiness, we are living a life steeped in Menschy values and human interconnection. And if enough of us do that, the world will be just fine and we'll have all lived a very good life. Thanks so much. So let's go
Thank you,
for some
Josh.
questions. Yes.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you, Josh. Do we have some questions out there?
There's one. How much does a homogeneous life, a society, contribute to happiness? Less competition, inequality, discrimination. I mean, you can get back to the Scandinavian model versus Israel or America or other countries that are perhaps more multicultural, although I don't think that's the case necessarily. I don't want to stereotype any country, but I would think that a diversity, I mean, I'm biased toward diversity. What is your stationery say? Because God said diversity is a good thing. So yeah, so I think that we've seen inequality, we've seen discrimination for sure, but it does sensitize us to the need to combat it.
I'm curious, Josh, if, and this might be splitting hairs, but is there any distinction in the Jewish tradition between, say, happiness and joy?
That is a really interesting question because there are different words. I think joy probably would have less of that acceptance. And happiness really isn't about smiling or laughing. It's just about satisfaction. And joy is the walls of Jerusalem shaking at the joy of the bride and the bridegroom, as it's described in, I think, Jeremiah, as it's described in the prophets and in the Jewish wedding blessings. So I do think there is a difference. And there are other words too. Rina, Bitza, Vechedva, Ahava, Be'achva, Be'shalom, V'reyut is the song we sing for bride and, for a wedding couple, I should say, on their wedding day. And so peace also comes into play because peace, shalom, has several meanings, including, aside from hello and goodbye, it means peace, but it also means fulfillment and completeness. And the way that humans in relationship complete one another, that's also a source of joy.
Thank you.
Can I, you're speaking about Scandinavia. My husband is Dutch, and the Netherlands are the happiest people in the world. They're
number one, huh?
They are. No, they really are number one. And, in terms of war, I mean, they suffered, they were occupied by the Nazis completely,
Yeah,
and
no.
that's the scar that lingers to this day in Dutch society. But they are nonetheless the happiest people in the world. And it's because they've adopted a Bernie Sanders kind of government. So, I don't think you can get to a happy society unless you adopt, I hate to say it, sorry, a socialist kind of thing where everybody's taken care of. And no matter how good of a life we all aspire to, our politics has to come into that. And I don't think we'll ever be a Bernie Sanders kind of a country, but the Dutch, they've conquered the happiness thing through being that way.
I think this year has helped a lot of people understand how important government is. And then we're about to see it here in America. We're starting to see it. Israel is right now leading the way in terms of vaccines. It hasn't done so great in other aspects of COVID. But one of the reasons is because it's got socialized medicine, and they know that, in a pinch, the government does care about them, not so much the politicians, but the government as a whole, and especially the health system. and Israelis are so used to depending on that in emergencies. So yeah, I mean, I do think government plays a big role. I have heard in terms of Netherlands that it's been a struggle lately in with, well, I guess for all of Europe, with COVID and some of the things they've done. I'm not sure if that's absolutely true, but I've heard some.
Yeah, yeah. And if you sit and have coffee with them, as I've spent decades doing, they'll get all fired up about the politics. And last week, the rioters went around breaking the windows, and they get all fired up about stuff. But they, like I say, they're on top of the happiness surveys.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. Israel's had rioters too, and it's the ultra-Orthodox who are protesting the restrictions of the lockdowns. You know, and this would seem to be a population. If any population is used to having restrictions on their lives and limitations and boundaries, it would be the ultra-Orthodox. So it's hard to say why.
Marjorie.
Yeah, Rabbi Josh, if the root of happiness is acceptance, does the word simcha also mean acceptance?
It would be translated almost universally as happy. So the notion of acceptance came from that scholarly research, except that when you think of that festival of Sukkot, of Tabernacles, as the time of our rejoicing, Zman Simchatenu, the word simcha is used in rabbinic literature, actually in the Bible, in the Torah, to describe this holiday. It makes sense for it to be that. Just as when we think of Thanksgiving, which is of course modeled after Sukkot, it's not a time when we, go crazy. It's not New Year's Eve for us here in America. The way we celebrate Thanksgiving is to go around the table and say how thankful we are. And that is a much deeper form of happiness than New Year's Eve celebrations. So I would say that intuitively it is translated that way, but you don't see too many biblical translations or other translations that say simcha is acceptance.
Thank you.
Other questions? Or in the chat? It strikes me, Josh, that you were going through kind of the morning prayer and the various things that are delineated, and that perhaps one of the things that not just Judaism but our traditions have in common is that the ritual, the rhythms of the year where you bump into certain things, right, that you wouldn't necessarily bump into if you didn't do the ritual, and that's a way of centering us or allowing us to pay attention to what it is that's important.
Yeah, it's sort of the interconnection, and I'm not sure exactly if you were going in this direction, but what Maimonides talks about is that ritual and religion shouldn't be separated from the activities of day-to-day life. I'll show you one more thing since we have a minute, because I think this is fascinating. I didn't want to get into the weeds here, but Maimonides is talking about how you eat. And, some of it is anachronistic, but let's say number 3, we sort of did number 2. When one eats, one should always sit in one's place or recline on one's left side, and one should not ride, work, or agitate one's body until the food has been digested. So if you want the source of where your mother used to say, don't go outside after lunch, sit still for 20 minutes, it was from Maimonides. Someone who goes for a walk or works after eating will bring upon himself bad and difficult illnesses. In number 6, I hesitate to do this, but he was very interested in how one moves one's bowels. So one should not eat at the beginning of a meal things that purge one's bowels, such as grapes, figs, strawberries, pears, watermelons, or types of cucumber. He was a doctor. What did he know? He knew. He knew. So anyway, this is an important thing for you to know. You shouldn't have poultry and animal meat together at the same meal. Okay. They would go to bathhouses. So he talked about how you should wash yourself once every 7 days. And you should enter a wash house, not enter shortly after having eaten. That makes sense. When you leave a wash house, number 17, you should put on your clothes and cover your head externally so you don't catch a cold. Maimonides was really the first Jewish, we say Jewish mother, but Jewish parent. We want to be egalitarian about it. You'll catch a cold. In the winter, it is good to anoint oneself with oil in the wash house. Number 18, very important. He was a doctor, remember. Don't bloodlet frequently. Okay? Just saying. But the way he mixed medicine with what we would call religion, but really it's all about sort of ritual and religious values, that value of moderation, is important. I think we would be very wary of it because we certainly don't want our doctors to be ruling based on the way they read the Bible. That we want them to follow science. Maimonides was following what he thought was science. It was science in his day, and there was no contradiction between the science that he followed and the ethical values that he espoused from his religious tradition. So it's a whole different perspective. If I haven't grossed you all out, give me a few minutes, I'll keep trying.
The good life is gustatory.
It is.
Any other questions, comments?
Rabbi Hammerman, could you just talk about the Sabbath and happiness? Make a comment or two?
Oh, that's a good point. Thank you, Carol. Well, I mean, the Sabbath very much, is geared toward restoring one's energy as God's energy was restored after the 6 days of creation. It says in the book of Genesis, Shabbat vayinafash, God rested. Shabbat, the word Shabbat comes from the word rested. Vayinafash, and replenished his soul. So that's in essence what we do on the Sabbath. And staying away from technology, staying away from obligations of work and even travel were important elements and are important elements, as well as spending time with family, ideally in a non-COVID situation, and having lots of food. One of the keys to Shabbat, to Sabbath observance, is what is called oneg, which means celebration, but again, celebration, not just pure joy, but celebration usually having something to do with eating. That's why at the end of our services, we have what's known as an oneg Shabbat, which is basically, let's have some cookies. So Shabbat is very important to replenishing the soul and has become even more important in our day. One might say we've had a sabbatical year, this COVID year, which for each of us has been a sabbatical in a different form, but the enforced restrictions to our homes have been very Sabbath-like. So thanks, Carol.
Indeed. Anything else? Cheryl, I'm sorry, yeah, please.
Go ahead.
I just have a question about, have you guys been able to go to synagogue then on Saturdays? Or you can't really do Zoom, right? Or
actually, it's, sorry.
Meld the technology in with your not technology.
You're asking a very key question, which early on in the process, we had to confront the imperfections of the choices that we had to make. It was the lesser of evils in a way. We normally, although we will live stream services from time to time in ordinary circumstances, we don't fiddle with technology. We sort of put it on and have it there and then just show the service. But doing Zoom, as you know, it involves an awful lot more technological work. Everything had to be reimagined, as it has in all religious traditions. We had to figure out what to do with music. There are certain things you can't do on Zoom, and certain things you can't do in a room with people during the COVID period. We intended to be very conservative with a small c, even though religious institutions were given opportunities, perhaps more so than other places of gathering. Part of that is political, and part of it was because of the great need for people to find community. But we were able to successfully, I think, figure a way to do it online for the most part. We've had life cycle events that have had to either be postponed or modified, in some cases with bar mitzvahs, and of course with funerals, with burials. There's an in-person element, but it's very much been modified this year. So we've had to make compromises in technology. Being the conservative movement, we're not as strict about it, although we are fairly observant. The ultra-Orthodox and the Orthodox congregations nearby have much more of a challenge, because they wouldn't use technology for their services for the most part, and needed to be in person. So I will say one other thing, and this is really important. In Judaism, there are 613 commandments. Any of them can be superseded, basically, if a life is at stake. So in order to save a life, which in COVID means to be socially distant, we don't have to keep the Sabbath in the way we would normally keep the Sabbath.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you, Josh.
Great question. Yes, thank you.
Any other final questions? We've just got a few more minutes. I often think about, as we've done this over the past few years, having the rabbis come on. It's always from the Christian clergy perspective. It seems like we went to the Votech and they went to the big college. So it's always great to have you present, Josh. Thank you for your thoroughness, wisdom, the insights tonight. Really just a wonderful presentation. For those of you who would like to perhaps delve a little more deeply into what it is that Josh was doing as he was zooming through the various commandments and people and issues, I know that I think he's recorded it, I've recorded it as well, so if you want a copy, you certainly can get that. And so just let me know or let Josh know and we can get that to you. Also, just a reminder that next week, Dr. Kareem Adib will be talking about the same question: what is the life worth living from the Muslim perspective? And then our final presenter will be Father John Gillians. He's a Greek Orthodox priest in Bridgeport, a good friend of our colleague Harry Pappas. He'll be presenting on the 11th. So please join us next week on the 4th, 7 o'clock here, same Zoom link, and also on the 11th for those perspectives. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Josh, for your presentation. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks, Josh.
Thank you so much. I really, really appreciated this and enjoyed doing this. Mark, I didn't record because I knew you were, so.
Okay, I've got it. So anybody who wants it, just let me know.
Yeah, I'd love to send it out to the congregation.
I'll pass it on to the clergy who are on this call.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good night, everyone.